Part 6. From Egyptian soil to Hellas. Isocrates insisted that philosophy is a product of Egypt, brought to Greece and Italy by Pythagoras, and one of the earliest attested uses of the term philosophia comes from Osiris of Isocrates. Contrary to the convictions maintained by the ancient Hellenes themselves, and regarded by them as a self-evident truth, modern scholars dismissed Egypt as the initial cradle of philosophy. This opinion was established during recent centuries and can be viewed as a consequence of the sustained attack on the wisdom of Egypt, pursued by certain radically disposed Christians and modern positivists. The denial that Egyptians are capable of developing any kind of philosophical thought is the result of a grave ideological errors and superstitions which have prevailed in the modern Western world since the Enlightenment and have almost destroyed or grossly deformed the Christian tradition itself. Though the Hellenic philosophers and scientists credited the Egyptians with achievements in all sciences and practical wisdom, regarding them as the model to be imitated and surpassed in almost every field of learning and art, modern scholars reject all these testimonies as groundless. The Egyptians could not have influenced Solon, Thales, Pythagoras, and Plato, they say, simply because they did not have philosophy. Why? Because they are morbid and lifeless, not sufficiently rational and creative, because the Aryan model, to use M. Bernal's term, quote, better, explains the, quote, progress of civilization. Because they are pleasure-loving people, lacking all deep religious feeling, idealism, and spirituality, in sharp contrast with Winckelmann's and Wilemowicz's Moellendorff's Greeks, who have all possible positive qualities, creative energies, and virtues in abundance. In short, because the Egyptians belong to the undeveloped lower and exotic race and represent by themselves the so-called mytho-poetical level of thought. A. Gardiner's sentence, delivered in 1927, is almost generally accepted as axiomatic. Quote, despite the reputation for philosophic wisdom attributed to the Egyptians by the Greeks, no people has ever shown itself more averse from speculations or more wholeheartedly devoted to material interests. And if they paid an exaggerated attention to funerary observances, it was because the continuance of earthly pursuits and pleasures was felt to be at stake, assuredly not out of any curiosity as to the why and whither of human life. End quote. Similarly, W.K.C. Guthrie, in A History of Greek Philosophy, says, quote, yet the torch of philosophy was not lit in Egypt, for they lacked the necessary spark which the Greeks possessed so strongly and embodied in their word philosophia. End quote. Another influential modern thinker and scientist, B. Russell, gives an equally dogmatic and superficial assertion. Quote, philosophy begins when someone asks a general question, and so does science. The first people to evince this kind of activity were the Greeks. Philosophy and science, as we know them, are Greek inventions. Philosophy and science begin with Thales of Miletus in the early 6th century BC. End quote. M. Bernal, despite his shortcomings and sometimes eccentric Afro-mythology, which is disputable in many respects, raises the opposite point of view, arguing that, quote, after the crushing of Neoplatonism, the Hellenic pagan descendants of Egyptian religion, and Gnosticism, its Judeo-Christian counterpart, Christian thinkers tamed Egyptian religion by turning it into philosophy. The three schools of thought that emerged from the debris of Egyptian religion were Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism. The Hermeticists remained defiantly Egyptian. The Neoplatonists were more Hellenized and focused their devotion on the divine Plato, while the Gnostics saw themselves as Christians. There is little doubt that Hermeticism was the earliest of the three and had a critical influence on the formation of the other two movements. End quote. The question regarding the origins of Hermeticism, Platonism, and Gnosticism is not as simple as the schematic picture would like to suggest, but in certain respects the straightforward perspective is a reinterpretation and re-establishment of the ancient views firmly held, among others, by Plutarch, the Middle Platonist and Delphic priest who, following Herodotus and other Hellenic historians, argued that much of Hellenic philosophy had been introduced from Egypt. Plutarch believed in an essential unity between Egyptian and Hellenic religion, despite their different styles of expression. Quote, "Nor do we think of the gods as different gods among different peoples, nor as barbarian gods and Hellenic gods, nor as southern and northern gods." End quote. At the same time, he maintained that the Egyptian religion is older, purer, and more profound because when men make use of consecrated symbols, some employed symbols that are obscure, but others those that are clear, in guiding the intelligence towards things divine. Further discussing the subject, Plutarch adds, quote, "Therefore in these matters above all we should take as a guide into mysteries the understanding which philosophy gives. Logon ek philosophius mustagogon." The fact that everything is to be referred to understanding, epiton logon, we may gather from the Egyptians themselves. End quote. In short, Egyptian hermeneutics, which explains religious myths and rites, itself constitutes a part of philosophy. It is not by accident that this assertion is followed by the remark about the festival in honour of Hermes, Thoth, during which the Egyptians eat honey and figs, saying the while, "Sweet is truth, gluku he aletheia." Truth is a key word here, because evidently it is the Egyptian Maat, related to the divine scribe Thoth, god of all wisdom, philosophy, mysteries, sacred rites, and creative magic, Heka. The sensible and noetic parts of philosophy, guided by Thoth, may be likened to the robes of Isis and Osiris, respectively. The robes of Isis are variegated in their colours. Quote, "For her power is concerned with matter, which becomes everything and receives everything. Light and darkness, day and night, fire and water, life and death, beginning and end." But the robe of Osiris has no shading or variety in its colour, but only one single colour, like to light. End quote. Therefore, the noetic understanding, or the Osirian intellection, when Osiris and Ra constitute the unity, because without the intelligible light of Ra, Osiris lies in the psychic darkness, is pure and simple, quote, "shining through the soul like a flash of lightning," end quote, and it affords an opportunity to touch and see at once. In order to show a relationship between the Egyptian symbols and philosophical exegesis, we should provide another excerpt from De Isidae et Osiridae. Plutarchus writes, and this is a long quote coming here, "For this reason, Plato and Aristotle call this part of philosophy the apoptic or mystic part, inasmuch as those who have passed beyond these conjectural and confused matters of all sorts by means of reason, to logo, proceed by leaps and bounds to that primary, simple, and immaterial principle, and when they have somehow attained contact with the pure truth abiding about it, they think they have the whole philosophy completely, as it were, within their grasp. This idea at the present time the priests intimate with great circumspection in acquitting themselves of this religious secret and in trying to conceal it, that this god Osiris is the ruler and king of the dead, but he himself is far removed from the earth, uncontaminated and unpolluted, and pure from all matter that is subject to destruction and death. But for the souls of men here, which are compassed about by bodies and emotions, There is no association with this god except insofar as they may attain to a dim vision of his presence by means of the apperception which philosophy affords. Plen hoson oniratos amoru thagaein noesiae dia philosophias. But when these souls are set free and migrate into the realm of the invisible and the unseen, the dispassionate and the pure, then this god becomes their leader and king, since it is on him that they are bound to be dependent in their insatiate contemplation, and yearning for that beauty which is for men unutterable and indescribable. With this beauty, Isis, as the ancient story declares, is forever enamoured and pursues it and consorts with it, and fills our earth here with all things fair and good that partake of generation. End quote. This text is no less than a clear example of the Egyptian Platonism, not just a reading of Plutarch. Isis, the mistress of transformative magic, or rather a blissful theurgy, itself stands as a lady philosophy, enamoured of the immaterial principle. Modern scholars, deprived of all the theurgic imagination and grace, may still insist on their rejection of Egyptian philosophy, but the fact remains that Pythagoras and Plato brought something important from Egypt, connected with the theory of ideas, the divine archetypes and their images or symbols, the mathematical sciences regarded in a mystical sense, and the conception of the immortal winged soul, Ba, wandering in search of her true identity, and thereby following the precept of Horus Ra, Apollo. Know thyself. The soul seeks to know truth, Ma'at, and live by it. When her ascent is completed, the soul turns into the luminous intellect, Ach, contemplates the forms in the solar bark of Ra. It is not too difficult to find the prototypes of images used in Plato's Phaedrus. Most probably the Republic is also based on the Egyptian models, according to Crantor, as related by Proclus. Quote, Plato's contemporaries mocked him, saying that he was not the inventor of his Politeia, but that he had copied Egyptian institutions. End quote. The Egyptian form of government was imitated by the Pythagoreans, along with the methods of philosophical ascesis, aimed at purifying the human soul and harmonizing with the perfectly arranged state, regarded as an imago of the divine cosmos, both sensible and noetic. Evangelou maintains that the Pythagorean pursuit of mathematical sciences and care of the soul are brought from Egypt. Quote, through Plato and the Platonic tradition, this type of philosophy, more than any other, contributed to shaping the Hellenic view of man, as an ignorant captive whose true liberator is Lady Philosophy. End quote. However, we must remember that certain selected ideas and elements brought from Egyptian soil to Hellas were removed from the context of integral sacred civilization and put into the foreign barbaric environment where these elements, though synthesized and artificially united in the new compound, inevitably stood outside of the mainstream of life. They could function only as a sort of Pythagorean esotericism, as a clearly defined philosophy, rationalistic exceptionalism, quite strange or even dangerous for the rest of society. Maybe this is the reason why Pythagoreans were persecuted and Socrates put to death. It was quite different in Egypt, where every philosopher belonged to the state staff and had no need to define himself as an exceptional case. It is possible that the nickname philosophos itself betrays the tension between the distant wisdom, still the possession of Egypt, and the local socio-political and psychological climate in Greece and Italy, the mental structures of which were organised according to the different value patterns. Perhaps the radical tension revolutionised the Hellenic thought, and partly at least can explain the rise of independent philosophical discourses aimed at the fundamental questioning of everything. In a sense, this unnaturally mutated beast, a hybrid fueled by the powerful enthusiasm of sophists, physiologists and rationalists, betrayed both Egypt and the archaic past of Greece. For this or some similar reason, P. Kingsley claims that Plato had killed his father Parmenides, arguing as follows, quote, "What would soon be covered over and rationalised in Greece was preserved and developed in India. What in the West had been an aspect of mystery, of initiation, became classified and formalised in the East." End quote. The great traditionalist writer F. Schuon makes an acute observation in the same vein. Quote, "On the whole, Plato expressed sacred truths in a language that had already become profane. Profane because rational and discursive rather than intuitive and symbolist, or because it followed too closely the contingencies and humours of the mirror that is the mind, whereas Aristotle placed truth itself and not merely its expression on a profane and humanistic plane." End quote. Neither P. Kingsley's nor F. Schuon's claims can be accepted straightforwardly. They require further discussion, because Plato's language may be regarded not as profane, but simply as different, more suited to the contemporary milieu of Hellenic thought, which required rational argumentation and definition. In a sense, we can speak of Plato as Parmenides redivivus. The vehicle of pedagogical persuasion was transformed, and thereby Parmenides, like the archetypal Osiris, was ritually killed. However, the Parmenidean spirit resurrected was reinforced and strengthened by the divine Plato.